born in discovery and settlement, forged in the fires of conquest and war. A state very young in years, but a nation rooted in its British origins, ever looking back to the motherland. Of all the films that I have made, this one is the most important to me, and in many ways, the most difficult. After all, I am a Canadian. In the words of our recent Prime Minister, I live this country in my bones every breath I take. I have been east and west, north and south. Still, I haven't seen all the wonders that this great land offers, nor fully appreciated all the places that were of such critical importance to the history of this nation. In recent years, too many Canadians have become detached from that history, and it isn't all their fault. The message went out some time ago. Our history is both bad and boring, a source of shame rather than pride. In truth, Canada was born out of one of the most dynamic and pivotal periods in world history since the Bronze Age. Out of tumultuous fires, the Canadians emerged from the crucible of history, poured into the mold of British North America. Of course, the Canadian story does not start on July 1st, 1867. The time of Confederation was only the culmination of a process set in motion 90 years earlier. The artificial border, as Trump called it, was established through decades of warfare. One can argue that there is in reality no hard start date at all for those who settled these lands, who cleared the fields, built the towns and the cities. Those who laid the foundations of the nation saw themselves as French, English, Scottish, and Irish, with truly ancient unbroken origins. Many Canadians still consciously identify with their European ethnic origins today, while also recognizing a common Canadian identity forged in our collective history. Canadian ethnic origins are represented on the Canadian coat of arms, found for instance on the cover of every Canadian passport, and several versions of the national flag prior to the maple leaf. The triple lion represents England, the single lion, Scotland, the harp, Ireland, and the fleur-de-lis, France. The lion and unicorn likewise hold British and French flags. The triple leaves, connected to a single stem, represents the coming together of these different ethnic groups in the forming of the Canadian state and identity. The critical role of these ethnic groups in the formation of Canada has very recently been re-acknowledged by Prime Minister Mark Carney, who asserted that Canada is the most European of non-European countries. The seeds of the Canadian nation were planted by France and Britain, and it's the collective experience of these settlers who formed the Canadian identity, which some other later European immigrants would assimilate into. Indigenous peoples, who are native to this land and who played an immense role in our collective history, are their own distinct and proud nations, with separate origins, histories, and native languages. In the late 15th century, the sunset of the medieval period, the European powers were scrambling to compete against one another in an economic and military arms race. Each power wanted to find a quicker passage to the lucrative trade with East Asia to bypass the Silk Road. John Cabot became a citizen of Venice and began a career as a trader. Commissioned by King Henry VII of England, he set out from Bristol, and on June 24, 1497, they made landfall. Though the exact location is unknown, it was most likely either along the east coast of Newfoundland or Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Though they had made a momentous discovery, they went ashore only long enough to resupply their water and plant flags, claiming the land for the King of England and the Catholic Church. Yet nothing immediately came of this claim, and it left an opening. A number of other explorers were soon to follow, but most significant was when in April of 1534, King Francis I commissioned Jacques Cartier, a French Breton mariner, to find the Western Passage. He had already worked aboard the ship of a Venetian explorer who claimed to have made trips to Newfoundland and Brazil. He was likewise commissioned to find islands where it was said great amounts of gold could be found. Needless to say, he didn't find that gold. But what he did find was even more valuable. And we are blessed by the fact that Cartier wrote an account of his travels. It's also in his book that we first hear the word Canada. He made landfall around the place he named Lac Sablon, now a Quebec town near the border with Labrador. Now, he didn't have a very high opinion of the place, but it was here that he first made contact with the indigenous population and provides a description of the first North American indigenous peoples. He said, "Here are men of fine shape and stature, but indomitable and savage. They wear their hair tied on the top of their head, like a bunch of hay, passing through it a small piece of wood or something similar, in place of a pin, and they also attach there some bird feathers. They wear skins, men and women, the latter being completely covered and girdled at the waist, which the men are not. They paint themselves with certain red colors, and they make their boats of the bark of the boule tree, and take large quantities of seal." From here he went further south, discovering Nova Scotia. They made extensive contact with the indigenous peoples there, with whom they traded and built a friendship. The French were received very kindly in return. Cartier made many gifts to them of simple things that they had on board for making trade, such as iron knives, tools, bells for women, and other small trinkets. Cartier's astute observations of their habits, language, and mode of living are our best record for the lifestyle and culture of pre-contact indigenous peoples of the East Coast. On the 16th of May, 1535, Cartier would undertake his second and most ambitious venture. He sailed down the St. Lawrence, which Aboriginals informed him led to Canada. By this they meant the town named Stadacona, roughly where modern Quebec City is today. Town in the Iroquoian language is Canada, and from this the French began to call the entire region Canada. On the third voyage, Cartier tried to establish a settlement known as Charlesbourg Royal, near what is now Quebec City, but they suffered from scurvy and came under attack by indigenous peoples who had become inexplicably hostile and killed many of the crew. When the ice melted, Cartier would leave and never return. Though no major settlements were being centrally organized in Canada between 1542 and 1605, there was likely some unorganized settlement. European fishermen were routinely sailing to North American waters, primarily fishing cod, which was so abundant at that time that dropping any net in would result in a guaranteed haul. They had established small seasonal outposts in Newfoundland, so that by 1583, when Sir Humphrey Gilbert landed in Newfoundland to claim or reclaim it for Britain, there was already a settlement of fishermen there, some of whom didn't take kindly to Gilbert's quest, especially as it involved levying tax on them. From the time of 1583, Newfoundland was a small but active colony of Britain, which oddly enough makes Newfoundland the oldest part of Canada, but also the last to join Confederation. opting in only in 1949. However, the honors of establishing the first true permanent European settlement in Canada is generally granted to sailor, soldier, and explorer Samuel de Champlain. Born to a family of sailors, he learned navigation and mapping skills as a boy from his father. He served as a soldier for King Henry IV of France. In 1603, he went along with other merchant traders to North America. He mapped out the regions, became familiar with the geography and the native population, with whom he strove to develop a good relationship. He would become fluent in the Algonquin language. Champlain returned to North America in 1604 as a chief navigator for the settlement expedition organized by Pierre Dugas, whom Henry IV had named the Lieutenant Governor of New France. They set out with 79 settlers, including Champlain and Matthew de Costa, an Afro-French translator, the first African to set foot in North America, who spoke Dutch, English, French, Portuguese, Mi'kmaq, and Pidgin Basque. They first built a temporary encampment on St. Croix Island, now part of Maine, then at St. John, New Brunswick. Dugas may have established a temporary settlement there, but he would move to establish a more permanent site at Port Royal, Nova Scotia in 1605. This site was chosen for very strategic reasons. It's a highly sheltered bay with only one narrow channel which could be defended from land. However, after a few years, Port Royal was abandoned due to certain legal trade monopoly disputes. In 1608, Dugas and Champlain would set out to establish the first real civilian settlement at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, with its foundations rooted in the fur trade. Dugas, however, did not go personally at this time, but charged Champlain to act on his behalf. Champlain called the settlement Quebec, after the Algonquin word for the place, meaning a narrow passage or strait, where the river narrows. This makes Quebec the oldest permanently inhabited European settlement in all of North America. And though Jamestown is a year older than it, it ceased to exist as a town while Quebec blossomed into the beautiful European-style city it is today. Champlain formed an alliance with the Wendat, also known as the Huron, and the Algonquin. In return, the French helped them fight the Iroquois, traded with them, and gave them knowledge of European tools and technologies. The early settlers were totally unprepared for just how cold Canada is compared to France. Of Champlain's 28-man crew, only 8 survived the first winter. And even then, just barely. Despite the incredible hardship, they persevered. In the spring, ships arrived from France bringing new men and supplies. The settlement expanded, began to cultivate crops and build fortifications, and Champlain worked to build up a trade network with the local tribes, as well as return to exploring the continent, traveling up the Ottawa River, first as far as Pembroke, and later he would go all the way to Lake Nipissing, and then down the French River to Lake Huron, and then back around through the Peterborough region, guided all the while by his indigenous allies. At the same time as the foundations of New France were being mapped out by Champlain, Quebec was not the only colony being established. Just a year before the establishment of Quebec, British settlers had established themselves at Jamestown, Virginia. The settlers of New France, under the leadership of Champlain, found themselves very quickly in a race with the British, which would soon spill over into open war. In July of 1613, the English, led by the Admiral of Virginia, Samuel Argall, more famously known perhaps for his abduction of Pocahontas, launched a surprise attack on the Port Royal settlement in Nova Scotia, which the French called Acadia. The settlers were forced to live with the Mi'kmaq to survive. and the British reasserted their claims on Acadia. In 1621, King James of England, seeking to establish a foothold in the region and undermine the expanding French colony, granted Sir William Alexander, the first Earl of Stirling, a descendant of Somerlet, exclusive rights to all of Acadia, which he named New Scotland, Nova Scotia in Latin. William Alexander established the coat of arms, which are still used today. However, the French still controlled the region. King Charles I authorized the capture of French colonies in the New World, and seizing the opportunity, William Alexander poured nearly his entire fortune into establishing Scottish settlements in the region of what is now Annapolis Royal, establishing a fortress there named for King Charles.
So when we're looking at these earthworks, we have to remember that they were dug all by hand, spades and picks, and it's quite a massive work here, actually.
At the same time, Sir James Stewart of Killeth established a settlement in Cape Breton at Baleine and built Fort Rossomer, of which nothing much survives today, at least above soil level. The French made some effort to expel them, but were successfully resisted by the Scots. The newly established Scottish colony raided French and Portuguese ships and settlements. However, the French were not without their victories. The Scottish settlement of Sir James Stewart in Cape Breton was devastated by French raids, and Sir Stewart and 17 other colonists were taken by the French in chains, and forced to build the French a new fortress on Cape Breton called Fort St. Anne, located at what is now called English Town, of which not much more than a marker of the site now remains. Despite the valiant efforts of the Scottish, the French would get the last laugh in the conflict. For when the English and French negotiated an end to the conflict, Charles I agreed to hand all the lands of Acadia and Quebec back to the French, in exchange for Louis XIII paying his dowry. The Scottish settlers were forced to leave, and Sir William Alexander lost almost his entire fortune and dwindled away the rest of his years. Sir David Kirke, one of the Scottish settlers, was knighted and made the governor of Newfoundland, but less than 20 years later he would die in jail. While the Scottish were trying and failing to establish their own colony, Champlain was building up Quebec, as well as establishing the settlement of Trois-Rivières. He died in 1635, and his original burial site is thought to be somewhere near where the Notre-Dame de Quebec Cathedral is today, though its exact location is unknown. Somewhere beneath the buildings and streets of the city lies its founder, a part of the very city itself, almost like Roman Ramus. The following years saw an increase in immigration from France, including a conscious effort to encourage women to settle there, called the Filles du Roi, Daughters of the King. They knew that to compete with the English in the New World, they needed to drive up their population numbers, and they were falling dramatically behind. Montreal was founded in 1642, when a group of settlers were led there to establish the Ville Marie, which was intended to be a utopian Catholic community. They likewise took back control of the Port Royal fortification. The European settlements and population in North America at this time was still small, and in Canada, tiny. In 1640, the entire European population of New France is thought to have been not in the thousands, but the low hundreds. Yet the low European population figures and the reliance upon native allies also meant that they became dragged into their tribal conflicts. This was the case with the Iroquois War, which saw the English and Dutch aid their allies, the Iroquois Confederacy, against the Algonquin and their allies, the French. Yet the French population figures were set for a dramatic change. By the 1650s, European settlers numbered about 3,000 throughout New France, as people increasingly took the risk to settle in the New World. These were accompanied by Jesuit missionaries, who sought to convert the indigenous peoples to Christianity. And in 1657, the first Catholic bishopric was created for New France. It was during this period the term Canadian begins to be used to refer to French people who settled in the lands they called Canada. But not all French were Canadians. Those who dwelled in what we call the Maritimes now were known as the Acadians, those of the region which the French knew as Acadia. So the ethnic name Canadian begins as a term which solely referred to the French living primarily in what is now Quebec, which to some Canadians might seem like a very peculiar turn of events. But though the French had established settlements in Acadia, they had not consolidated power to the same degree as in Canada. And in 1654, the English, led by Robert Sedgwick on the orders of Oliver Cromwell, launched an expedition for its capture. Leading a large force from the colonies of New England, they captured Acadia, under terms that the French settlers would be allowed to stay and practice their religion. Yet, control over Acadia would swing back again in just 16 years, when the signing of the Treaty of Breda handed control of it again back to the French. These early back-and-forth swings shows that the British Crown clearly just saw these regions in Canada as peripheral bargaining chips rather than British territory. Most of the real British development was going into New England and elsewhere, and for good reasons. These areas were and are less harsh and likely slightly more productive. Regions of Canada were seen as either fur trading outposts or fishing communities. It would first be the great power rivalry between France that would shift the British perspective on the importance of control over Canada, and later events south, which would shift its focus north even further. Exploration of the Great Lakes region and as far south as the Arkansas River in 1673 established French claims, and 10 years later, Sieur de la Salle would traverse the entire Mississippi and claim Louisiana in honor of French King Louis XIV. This saw French claims of sovereignty extending from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Henry de Tonty, La Salle's lieutenant, known as Iron Hand for his prosthetic limb, began building a series of fortifications in order to transform these claims into reality, including Fort St. Louis in Illinois. The name Illinois is itself a French name derived from an indigenous name, which probably explains the typical silent S at the end. In 1718, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, an administrator of New France, founded the city of New Orleans. New France was arrayed against a much larger force. The New England colonies in 1700 numbered around 250,000. The English-controlled Hudson's Bay Company had also claimed, well, of course, the Hudson's Bay, but they were expanding their commercial holdings throughout the continent, dominating the fur trade. Nevertheless, undaunted, the French decided to push their luck against the Newfoundland colony. In 1696, they launched the Avalon Campaign, where a concerted effort was made to gain control of Newfoundland. Almost every English settlement, including St. John's, was destroyed. The English responded by recapturing the island and launching raids from New England on Acadia, destroying Port Royal again. By the 1710s, Acadia was a contested battleground, part of the War of Spanish Succession, also called Queen Anne's War. Port Royal was captured by the English and renamed Annapolis Royal. And in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, France formally handed over the region of Nova Scotia, minus Cape Breton, to the British. The French settlers were allowed to remain, but many English and Scottish settlers from New England began to relocate to what was then called Nova Scotia. The French, having retained Cape Breton, began fortifying it with new military outposts. If you're familiar with Cape Breton today, you might wonder why the French were so keen on securing this location above all else. And the reason is for military strategy. If they could control Cape Breton, they could still exert control over the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which they needed to secure in order to secure their Canadian colonies. If the British controlled Cape Breton and Newfoundland, then they could much more easily institute a trade blockade. Thus, the control of Cape Breton was extremely important strategically. It was at this time that Louisbourg was established. By the 1740s, it had developed into the most impressive fortifications built in North America, and a city with a population of over 2,000, which was not at all small for the time and location. It was intended to serve as a permanent bastion of French control over the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Today, it stands as one of the most impressive National Historic Sites in Canada, one of the finest reconstructed 1700s period fortresses and villages in the world, and a spectacularly beautiful place. It doesn't get more Canadian than this. As New France grew in power and expanded its military presence, tensions with the British colonies increased. Many didn't like the presence of the French for religious reasons. They were settlers of extreme Protestant backgrounds who saw the Catholic religion of New France as a natural enemy. Though the Treaty of Utrecht had handed over most of Nova Scotia to the English, there were disputes over the extent of Acadia in what is now Maine and New Brunswick. Further, the Micmac were not a party to the treaty, and the French allied tribes in the area continued to attack English settlements. The British conflicts with the Wabanaki Confederacy would grow into the Drummers' War from 1722 to 25, which resulted in a loss of French territory in what is now Maine. Then, in 1744, with the War of Austrian Succession waging in Europe, the British colonies decided to go on the offensive against New France. The declaration reached the French before any attack, and they were able to get in the first blow, sending ships to Canso and Annapolis Royal. They failed to take the town, but the New Englanders counterattacked, besieging the fortress of Louisbourg for 6 weeks and forcing a surrender. The French attempted to recover the fort for the following 2 years, and the Wabanaki Confederacy launched an allied campaign against the British settlements around Acadia, raiding and destroying the settlements of Saratoga, New York, and forcing the British to retreat from all the settlements north of Albany. The offensive was brutal but very successful, and it resulted in the British pushing for a peace treaty, which saw them surrender Louisbourg and return control of Cape Breton to France. The 1748 treaty, which returned Louisbourg, angered many English colonists who had fought hard to take it. Edward Cornwallis, who had experience putting down rebellion as he helped defeat the Scottish Gaels in the Battle of Culloden, was appointed to counter French influence in Nova Scotia. 2,500 settlers were recruited for the venture. Some came from Liverpool, Bristol, and London, but many others were sought from the Protestant community of Ulster Scots. They made shore at what is now downtown Halifax and began to build a fortification. The Micmac were attacking and killing settlers in the province. Cornwallis, who was made the governor of Nova Scotia, first trying to appeal to them for diplomacy, without success. In response to the constant killings and abduction of women, he issued a bounty for the scalp of any Indigenous man, and also for the capture of Indigenous women and children. Despite the bounty, only one scalp was ever returned for payment, and the raiding didn't stop. Cornwallis was a warrior of an old-fashioned sort. When putting down the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland, he locked suspected Jacobites in their homes and burned them to death. He was a hardened warrior, and those he was fighting against were as ruthless as he. Of the 383 settlers who had come to build Dartmouth, only 78 survived the Micmac attacks. This was a situation that Cornwallis was facing. It didn't end until 1761 with the signing of the Halifax Treaties that established peace between the English and the Micmac. By the late 1740s, France was acutely aware of its weakening position as compared to the British colonies. While New France had expanded dramatically to a population of around 70,000, the British colonies of New England had around 1 million, plus another 250,000 black slaves. To bolster their land claims, the governors of New France began building further west and south. A series of fortresses were established along the Mississippi Valley, all the way to New Orleans. In hindsight, it seems that the French took a far bigger bite than they could chew. They were far too overstretched and undermanned for the amount of territory that they were trying to claim, and the English were starting to realize it. When the French began constructing Fort Le Boeuf and Fort Duquesne near what is today Pittsburgh, English colonists were very unsettled. Petitions were made to the French to halt their construction, but it was ignored. In 1754, a band of English and Mingo warriors, led by then commander of the Virginia Regiment, George Washington, ambushed a small French garrison in Jumonville Glen, killing 10. This was answered by a French counterattack on Fort Necessity, which forced Washington to surrender. However, the British took the initiative in the war by seizing Fort Beausejour, near what is now Sackville, New Brunswick. As it was believed that the Acadian settlers were giving aid to the Micmac, and even partaking in their raids, the British Lieutenant Governor Charles Lawrence ordered their deportations. The English forces went region by region, gathering up Acadians by force and expelling them. Sensing the seriousness of the British intentions, France sent some of its best and most experienced generals and soldiers to defend New France, led by Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. When Britain got word of these military moves, it was no longer a squabble between the colonies, but an all-out war between Britain and France, known as the 7 Years' War, or in the United States, as the French and Indian War. The first 2 years of the war did not go well for the British. Despite their massive advantage in terms of numbers, the forces of the colonies were not as professional or experienced as the French. As they were preparing for an attack on Fort Louisbourg from Halifax, Montcalm and his regular French troops, supported by Canadians and Indigenous, attacked Fort William Henry. He likewise conducted a successful attack on Oswego. However, the following year was more difficult. The English had managed to block France's shipping routes, and they had not been able to resupply them with guns, powder, and other goods needed for the war. Their Aboriginal allies, who were being ravaged by smallpox at the time, were angry with Montcalm for preventing their looting and enslaving of the surrendered British, and blamed them also for the smallpox. Montcalm, understanding his limited forces and supplies, pulled back to secure the St. Lawrence. General Geoffrey Amherst, a lawyer from Kent who served in the War of Austrian Succession, led the British forces in the siege of Louisbourg. Once the mighty fort fell, his eyes focused upon Quebec's high walls. France, meanwhile, was busy planning an invasion of Britain herself. It was a plan that failed before it was really enacted, but it wasted a great deal of time, energy, and resources that were not going to the defense of New France. In 1760, Fort Niagara fell to the British, then the Thousand Islands bastions and Ogdensburg Fort. Then they came for Quebec. It was there that Montcalm bravely met the British forces led by James Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham. And here where the fate of New France was decided by the war god, whose spear dictates victory. Wolfe fell in battle, and Montcalm died the following day of wounds. Yet the British had carried the day, and the sun set upon the French rule of Canada. A heroic attempt was made to retake Quebec the following spring, but it was defeated, and then Montreal also fell before the end of summer. In 1763, France officially surrendered its colonies in Canada. Yet unbeknownst to many, they retained one thing: the islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon, just off the south coast of Newfoundland, which remains part of France to this day. By the end of the war, around 11,500 Acadians were deported from Nova Scotia. Some would end up as far as New Orleans, where they became known as the Cajuns, the name coming from Acadians. Even before the war had formally ended, a new wave of settlers for Nova Scotia had been organized, intentionally selected for their ethnic background, and referred to as New England planters. Settlers were offered the lands of the deported Acadians, and between 1759 and 1768, around 8,000 people or 2,000 families moved to take advantage of the offer, despite the still dangerous situation. Many were from the 13 colonies, while others were from England or were Ulster Scots from Northern Ireland, including my own 7th great-grandfather, Samuel MacLean, who with his brother Anthony arrived from Londonderry, Northern Ireland on the ship Hopewell, and accepted land which was then called Londonderry, Nova Scotia, in 1761. Over the next decades, many others would gradually make their way from the colonies or from Britain and Ireland to Nova Scotia. Life was not easy, and some colonists did not stay. Canada was still largely just wilderness, filled with dangers and just recovering from war. Even the offer of free or extremely low-cost land was only taken up by the most adventurous when people had the option to settle in the far more developed colonies to the south. The most extensive road at the time was built by the French between 1731 to 1737, which connected Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal. The English had also built another road from Halifax to Annapolis Royal. Other than that, there were forest paths, riverboats, and ships. Even getting to the land that you acquired would be a Herculean task. They were not getting off the boats to an easy life, but one of complete uncertainty, where there existed almost nothing. These people took a wilderness and made of it civilization. All of the history up to this point is simply the history of British and French North America, and it's common to Canadians and Americans. For Canadians of British origin, our history is intermingled with that of the Americans, like two separate trees growing from the same seed. Yet by 1763, the time was fast approaching when the roots of the 13 colonies would be violently separated from the same cluster and replanted in revolution. In 1763, King George III made the Proclamation, in which he established the provinces of the North American colonies, including Quebec, which at that time included much of what is now Ontario and the areas of the United States around the St. Lawrence. However, restrictions were placed upon French Catholics because the proclamation formally established British law in the colonies, but in practice it effectively banned Catholicism, for part of the oath required one to swear allegiance to the king as head of the Anglican Church, to deny transubstantiation, part of Catholic doctrine, and to renounce the Pope. James Murray, a military officer of Scottish origin, acted as the first governor of Quebec. He had seen action in the Battle of Louisbourg and the Plains of Abraham. However, his leniency in allowing French legal customs and his disagreement with trying to make Catholics swear the allegiance earned him the ire of some powerful Protestant merchants, who successfully had him recalled to Britain in 1766. However, his views on the situation in Canada, and that of Guy Carleton, the governor of Quebec which followed him, succeeded in conveying the situation to the British government, and in 1774, the Quebec Acts were made law by the British Parliament, which guaranteed the freedom of worship to Catholics and restored all Catholic property rights. This likely wasn't all due to the kindness of the British administration. They needed the French of Quebec on side and feared stoking rebellion. Yet ironically, the appeasement of Catholics was one of the key acts which would prove the undoing of a united British North America. While some consider the American Revolution as a tax revolt, taxes were just one issue among many. Extreme Protestant groups had been pivotal in the founding of the colonies, and they hated and feared the Catholics of Quebec, with whom they had been fighting for decades. The idea that they were now going to be united into a single empire that vowed to respect and protect Catholics was too much for some. It was labeled as one of the 5 intolerable acts by the American revolutionaries. John Adams called it dangerous to the interests of the Protestant religion and of the colonies. And papers like the New York Journal proclaimed the savages of the wilderness were never expelled to make room in this, the best part of the continent, for idolaters and slaves. They were likewise furious about the expansion of the Quebec borders. The Pennsylvania Journal wrote, "By this act, the liberties of America and the Protestant religion are in danger of being totally subverted." When the 13 colonies went into open rebellion against the British in 1775, neither Quebec nor Nova Scotia followed. Though Nova Scotia, recently settled by many former colonists of New England, was more sympathetic to their cause. On the 14th of September, as the Americans were besieging the British in Boston, and even as American troops marched north towards Montreal, George Washington made an address to the inhabitants of Canada. He appealed to them to join the American Revolution, saying, "Above all, we rejoice that our enemies have been deceived with regards to you. They have persuaded themselves. They have even dared to say that the Canadians were not capable of distinguishing between the blessings of liberty and the wretchedness of slavery, that gratifying the vanity of the little circle of nobility would blind the eyes of the people of Canada. Come then, my brethren, unite with us in an indissoluble union. Let us run together to the same goal. We have taken up arms in defense of our liberty, our property, our wives, and our children. We are determined to preserve them or die. We look forward with pleasure to that day, not far remote, we hope, when the inhabitants of America shall have one sentiment and the full enjoyment of the blessings of a free government." While Washington appealed through words, he acted with the gun. By the time the proclamation was issued, Fort St. Joanne, south of Montreal, was already under siege. When it fell on November 3, 1775, the British garrison in Montreal retreated, fearing that their forces were too small to hold the relatively unprotected city. Abandoning the city to the Americans, they fell back to the walls of Quebec. The British had no abundance of forces for the defense of Quebec. 1,200 men in all, made up of British soldiers, Canadian militia, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland volunteers, and 200 elite Gaelic warriors of the Royal Highland Emigrants. The Gaels fought in kilts, carried broadswords, and were led by Lieutenant Colonel Alan Maclean, who was made second in command during the battle by Governor Guy Carleton. American General Montgomery launched the attack on the city on New Year's Eve in 1775, in the middle of a blizzard, believing that the storm would help provide cover. Leading approximately 2,000 men, he hewed through the city's wooden defenses and charged the blockhouse. They were greeted with a barrage of musket fire and grape shot, which instantly killed Montgomery and caused his forces to flee. Benedict Arnold, attacking from another direction, was wounded and also forced to abandon the attack. Though the British had met with success, the war had only just begun. In April of 1776, the British moved 11,000 reinforcements from Britain, Ireland, and volunteers from German principalities to defend Quebec. Governor Guy Carleton led a counter-offensive, and on June 17th, when his army reached Montreal, the Americans fled. Despite his success, Carleton was reprimanded for not having pursued the American forces more tenaciously, and he resigned as governor. As military disaster unfolded for the American attempts on Canada, another plan was evolving. The Eddy Rebellion saw a militia under the command of Jonathan Eddy, born in Massachusetts, attempt to bring the American Revolution to Nova Scotia, supported and equipped in part by American revolutionaries. Eddy and his force of around 500 men besieged Fort Cumberland. His attempt failed when the garrison held out and British reinforcements arrived and routed them. It was the only major rebellion at the time to break out in Canadian lands, and its failure saw the end of George Washington's hopes of a united continent through common popular rebellion. The Americans had few resources to devote to further Canadian advances. Loyalists in the 13 colonies fought tenaciously against the revolutionaries, and supported by the British regulars and resupplied through Canada, the fighting went on for years. However, by 1779, the British realized that they would not be able to win back control of the American colonies, and so they focused on taking control of lands in Maine and establishing it as a colony for Loyalists to relocate to. In May of that year, 640 troops set out from Halifax under the command of General Francis Maclean. He landed in Castline, captured the village, and began establishing Fort George. The Americans responded with the Penobscot Expedition, which sent a large naval force to besiege Maclean's position. Greatly outnumbered, he withstood a 21-day siege by the American forces before British reinforcements arrived. Then, the Americans, completely outflanked, lost 43 ships in the subsequent battle, making it the greatest American naval defeat besides Pearl Harbor. Much of Maine came under Loyalist control and was renamed New Ireland. However, when the war was brought to a legal end with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the British ceded New Ireland to the Americans, establishing a border that was not very different from that which continues to exist to this day. Francis Maclean didn't live to see what he fought for handed away. He fell ill and died in 1781 in Halifax, and is entombed along with so many other important figures in early Canadian history, beneath St. Paul's Church in Halifax, the oldest intact church in the country. Following the conclusion of the war, thousands of British settlers in America who had supported or fought for Britain, called Loyalists, were subject to hatred, harassment, and even property confiscation. As compensation for their loyalty and service, the Crown offered them free lands in Canada, and tens of thousands resettled in Nova Scotia and what would become Upper Canada, now Ontario. History had forever driven a wedge between the 13 colonies and Canada. While the Americans, in the grip of revolutionary zeal for freedom and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, fought against the Crown, the ancestors of many of the founding peoples of Canada chose instead to preserve those ancient connections to Britain, the monarchy, and the governing system that had grown out of 1,000 years of British tradition. To this day, the Canadian system of government is very similar to that which exists in Britain. While some have said that Canada's only identity is not being American, this is actually the inverse of history. Canadians are those who did not cast off their traditions and identity, while Americans rebelled against them and began to forge something new. Though this act of revolution is what initially created the split between Canadians and Americans, it would be further widened by events to follow. The vast majority of Loyalist settlers were English and Scottish, though there were some Irish and German as well. Many of the Scots were Highland Gaels, and Gaelic from the 1780s into the late 1800s was the third most spoken language in Canada. Entire counties such as Glengarry were almost entirely Gaelic speaking. Though not nearly as many Germans settled in Canada as the United States, specific religious factions favored Canada, and those with previous attachments to the British monarchy. The Constitution Act of 1791 was drafted to organize Canada following the American Revolution. It divided what was all known as Quebec into Upper Canada, mostly inhabited by those English and Gaelic-speaking Loyalists who had settled the area, and Lower Canada, inhabited mostly by French Canadians, known as Quebec today. Though their plans to conquer all of the British territories had failed in the 1780s, the new American elite had not abandoned their greater aspirations for the continent. Annoyed by the British support for the Aboriginal Tecumseh Confederacy of the Shawnee and ongoing border disputes, the American Congress grew increasingly favorable to a resumption of the state of war. With Britain distracted with the Napoleonic Wars, it was believed that they would be less able to intervene in the defense of Canada. On June 1, 1812, American President James Madison submitted a list of grievances against Great Britain to Congress, and the Congress voted 79 to 49 to declare war. Getting news of the declaration of war, Sir Isaac Brock reacted decisively. Born in Guernsey, Isaac had studied French from a young age and been noted as a brilliant student as well as an excellent boxer. He was 6'2" and strong, but he was also well-read, not only in military matters but history and philosophy. From a relatively modest background, he rose through the ranks of the British military, seeing combat in Batavia and Copenhagen. When he was stationed in Canada in 1805, he immediately worked to straighten out the terrible military situation, including thwarting a mutiny. Acquainting himself with American discourse to the south early on, Brock realized that there was a serious threat brewing long before the outbreak of the conflict. Ideas of a manifest destiny were on many American lips, including Thomas Jefferson, who said that conquering Canada would be just a matter of marching. Isaac knew that if Canada was to be maintained as a British colony, they needed to organize militarily, and fast. He set about building fortifications and battlements, improving existing defenses, and came into conflict with civilian administrators for appropriating lands and conscripting labor for the endeavor. Yet his actions, seen as extreme and unnecessary by some in 1808, were to prove decisive a few short years later. In 1810, Brock was given command of all the British forces stationed in Upper Canada, and when in October of 1811, Governor-General Gore left for England, Brock was given overall military and civilian control of Upper Canada, referred to as the President of the Council. All along, however, he had sought a reposting to Europe, where he believed that the major action in history was being waged in the Napoleonic War. Being a born warrior, he felt that he was missing his chance for glory posted far from the front. That chance would come in a dramatic way, and when in early 1812 he was finally offered a reposting to Europe, guided by the fates, he declined. By then he could already see the clouds of war on the horizon, and he felt in his heart that this was his moment, the culmination of so many years of work. It was his destiny to defend Canada. No sooner had the declaration of war been made by President Madison than Brock went into action. He sent word via William Mackay to the outpost at St. Joseph Island, led by Charles Roberts, giving him the option of attacking the American Fort Mackinac, based on his assessment of the local conditions. Roberts, with a host of First Nation allies, took the fort by surprise, not even aware that the war had been declared, and they surrendered. Yet the morale in Upper Canada was extremely low, and the position of the civilian government defeatist. Brock wrote in exasperation to Adjutant General Baines, saying, "My situation is most critical, not from anything the enemy can do, but from the disposition of the people. The population, believe me, is essentially bad. A full belief possesses them that this province must inevitably succumb. This predisposition is fatal to every exertion. Legislators, magistrates, militia officers, all have imbibed this idea, and are so sluggish and indifferent in all their respective offices, that the artful and active scoundrel is allowed to parade the country without interruption, and commit all imaginable mischief. What a change an additional regiment would make in this part of the province! Most of the people have lost all confidence. I, however, speak loud and look big." Taking the initiative, Brock launched an attack on Detroit in August of 1812, using subterfuge and bluff. Besieged by British forces and their indigenous allies under Tecumseh, Detroit surrendered, despite their garrison far outnumbering the British forces assailing them. The victory put wind in the sails of the Canadian recruits, who had been affected by pro-American propaganda of a doomed defense, and it also deprived the American forces of one of their launching pads for the invasion. The victory earned Major General Brock a knighthood and the title Savior of Upper Canada. They were honors he was not long to enjoy, for the fates had woven a different fabric. On October 13th, after an earlier abandoned attempt to cross the Niagara River, American forces attempted to storm Queenston Heights, not far from Niagara Falls. Brock, who was then at Niagara, awoke to hear the sound of cannon, and assembled his men and rode to Queenston, where the battle was already underway. British forces were firing upon American boats streaming across the river, while others fought to hold the village of Queenston. The Americans outnumbered the British 3-1, and when enough had made it to shore, they seized the heights and disabled the British artillery. Brock and his men made a valiant attempt to retake the heights, with Brock leading his men personally. In his charge, he was shot by a musket from the bushes at about 50 yards, directly in the chest, likely dying almost instantly. His chief aide, Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, continued the fight, but likewise fell and succumbed to his wounds. However, their sacrifices and bravery were able to sustain the battle into the afternoon, when British reinforcements finally arrived from Fort George under General Roger Sheaffe. The battle turned decisively against the Americans, who were forced into a disorderly retreat. In 1853, construction began of the memorial pillar known as Brock's Monument. Sir Isaac Brock and Lieutenant Colonel John MacDonald, are both interred there, having achieved the immortal status of heroes. It's a beautiful sight and a must-visit for any Canadian. Yet as important as the victory of Queenston Heights, it was far from the end. The war raged on, and Queenston Heights was only the opening salvo. In 1813, Colonel Henry Proctor, an Indigenous leader Tecumseh, tried to build on the success of taking Detroit, but suffered terrible defeats and were forced to retreat to Canada, losing the city. The Americans pursued them into Upper Canada, defeating and killing Tecumseh in the Battle of the Thames. Proctor was court-martialed for his failures. Fort George was captured, as was Fort Erie. York, the capital of Upper Canada, now Toronto, was pillaged and burned, as was Port Dover. In February 1813, spearheaded by the Glengarry Highlanders, British forces crossed the frozen St. Lawrence River at Prescott and attacked the American garrison at Ogdensburg. It is said that Alexander MacDonald, the Catholic bishop for Upper Canada, was with his Highlanders during their charge, wielding a crucifix-tipped staff. Though outnumbered, they routed the Americans and held the town and its fort for the rest of the war, ensuring the safety of British ships traveling the river. A little further downriver, the Americans planned to capture Montreal, sending armies to the city from the west and south. The western force was to move downriver and seize Cornwall before moving to Montreal. They managed to bypass Prescott and Ogdensburg under the cover of fog and darkness, but they were halted in Dundas by the militia, who, though only 200 in number, were able to hold them off long enough to allow a larger force to assemble. A few days later, near the current town of Morrisburg, British troops and Canadian militia, numbering only around 800, were waiting on chosen ground, the farm of Captain John Chrysler, the leader of the Dundas militia. Through excellent tactical planning, bravery, and a bit of divine intervention, the British managed to defeat the overwhelming American force, achieving one of the most spectacular underdog victories in New World military history, decisively turning the course of the war in a single battle. As the other American army was likewise routed in the Battle of Chanteguay just prior, the plan to attack Montreal was dashed, ending the St. Lawrence campaign in an American defeat. Then in August of 1814, 2,500 British troops, freed up from their victory over Napoleon, were dispatched to harass the American coasts and create a diversion. They attacked Virginia, defeated the American forces in the Battle of Bladensburg, and were then free to storm Washington, D.C. as the American President James Madison and his government fled in terror into the countryside. The White House was set ablaze, along with other government buildings. The attack and the burning was retribution for the American burning of York and Port Dover. Following this, the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, John Sherbrooke, ordered a naval force of 500 to seize Maine. Setting out from Halifax, they seized Bangor, Hampton, and Castlemaine, sunk 17 American ships, and re-established the colony of New Ireland. All of this culminated in the Battle for Baltimore, waged in September of 1814. A combined naval and land assault on the city ended in a British defeat. The bombardment by the British ships on Fort McHenry inspired the American Francis Scott Key to compose the poem Defense of Fort McHenry, which was later set to music and is better known now as the Star-Spangled Banner. The war finally ended in February of 1815 with the ratification of the Treaty of Ghent. It effectively recognized a stalemate, restoring almost all of the border to its pre-war status. Following the war, the situation in Canada developed along a similar line. Migrants, the vast majority from Britain and Ireland, continued to come to Canada to seek opportunity. People eventually began to move further west, though European settlement in the prairies and British Columbia was very sparse, only really starting around 1860, and major settlement only after 1880. The ethnic makeup of Western Canada is therefore somewhat different from Eastern Canada. The government of Upper Canada after the War of 1812 was administered by the Lieutenant Governor and his Executive Council, which was a non-elected body not legally responsible to the Parliament. There was also the Legislative Council, which functioned like the House of Lords, filled by lifelong appointees, which allowed the so-called family compact of oligarchic powers to govern the colony, until a small but violent rebellion broke out in 1837, and the Patriots' War, where ideological Republicans led unsanctioned cross-border military strikes from the United States. After the rebellion was crushed, Britain stepped in to reform the political system. The result was a merger of Upper and Lower Canada, roughly southern Ontario and Quebec, into a single province of Canada, and the institution of responsible government. Things might have stayed like that. If they had, the province of Canada could well have been its own state, with Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island all being their own separate, self-administered states. However, many of the intellectuals and elites in the British colonies in Canada were bound together by a common sense of identity. For French Canadians, practicality was a primary motive. However, without the added fear of the dangers to the south and the vision of leading men of the day, Canadian unity may never have taken place. Many politicians in the Canadian colonies in 1860 believed that when the American Civil War ended, they would turn their focus north. These fears were amplified when Irish Fenians began launching attacks across the American border with the aim of seizing Canadian territory. The maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island planned the Charlottetown Conference, initially thinking that it would be a discussion only about the unity of the maritime colonies. However, John A. Macdonald, the Scottish-born Highland-descended lawyer from Kingston, who had recently become the Premier of the province of Canada, learned of the meeting and asked to attend. It was a great success. They were all of the opinion that in order to secure a future for the British North America, they needed to unite. The details of this union were worked out in subsequent meetings in Quebec and London. The French strongly opposed a legislative union, wishing above all to preserve their unique language, culture, and self-rule. This was eventually supported by Macdonald, and the structure of a federation where each colony would retain its own legislature, with a central legislature for common national interest, was developed. Not all loved the idea. In Nova Scotia, anti-Confederation parties were formed, and Premier Tupper was roundly criticized. Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who began as an Irish nationalist but eventually became a loyalist, anti-Republican, and proponent of Confederation, as well as something of a Celtic scholar, was assassinated by a Fenian outside his apartment in downtown Ottawa. Prince Edward Island didn't join for several years, and Newfoundland didn't join until 1949. The Northwest Territories were incorporated into Canada in 1870 and eventually divided up into separate provinces. British Columbia joined the year after, with the demand that a railway be built. Macdonald, Cartier, Brown, McGee, Tupper, Tilley, Galt, Bernard are typically called the Fathers of Confederation and played a key role in establishing the Dominion of Canada. So then, who are the Canadians? At heart, the core of the Canadian identity is that of British and French North Americans. In the words of Sir John A. Macdonald, the Prime Minister of the Dominion of Canada, it was clear to them all that the best interest and present and future prosperity of British North America would be promoted by a federal union under the Crown of Great Britain And it seems to me, as to them, and I think it will also appear to the people of this country, that if we wish to be a great people, if we wish to form, using the expression which was sneered at the other evening, a great nationality, commanding the respect of the world, able to hold our own against all opponents, and to defend those institutions we prize, if we wish to have one system of government, and to establish a commercial union with unrestricted free trade between people of the 5 provinces, belonging as they do to the same nation, obeying the same sovereign, owing the same allegiance, and being for the most part of the same blood and lineage, if we wish to be able to afford to each other the means of mutual defense and support against aggression and attack, this can only be obtained by a union of some kind between these scattered and weak boundaries composing the British North American provinces, composed of people possessed of skill, education, and experience in the ways of the New World, people who are as much Canadians, I may say, as we are, people who are imbued with the same feelings of loyalty to the Queen and the same desire for the continuance of the connection with the mother country as we are, and at the same time have a like feeling of ardent attachment for this our common country, for which they and we would alike fight and shed our blood if necessary. When all this is considered, argument is needless to prove the advantage of such a union. Though much has changed since 1867, the Canadian identity, as outlined by the Fathers of Confederation, remains the true heart and spirit of Canada, without which we will cease to exist as a nation, possibly even a state. Our recent Prime Minister stated that Canada is the first post-nation state, a statement which severs the government from any attachment to the Canadian ethnic identity, transforming the state into a tree without roots, ready to be toppled by the next strong gust of wind. Well, that wind is blowing now, and to be blunt, the future of Canada is not at all certain. One thing is easy to foresee, however. History does not remain frozen. Time does not stop, and nations rise and fall. A people without roots are a people without a future. They are fallen trees in a forest, upon which the fungus grows, around which the trilliums blossom in the early warmth of spring. The survival of a nation doesn't depend on the success of the economy, trade, wealth, or even the might of its army. Many ancient peoples still exist who have none of these things. It lies in the heart and the memory of each and every man and woman. If this is forgotten, cast aside, or attacked as a relic of an unenlightened age, that nation will die, no matter how wealthy it might be, no matter how many trade deals it might have, no matter how large its population. Now is the time for Canadians to reconnect with their roots, so the awful wind of history will not sweep us away.